let's start with the first thing that you just said as you were closing out that great statement. You were saying it starts with changing the landscape of education, changing our school system. And, one of the things you were speaking about last night, which I was so interested in, and I love that Heritage, you're an educational organization, but education for changing public policy for education is key. This idea that classical education is not some like weirdo alternative thing that some people, get all excited about, but it was education for centuries until basically last 150 years of modern, whatever we want to call it, education, post-industrial revolution education. There's different interesting theories. I'm sure you have them on this, but educate me and our listeners, many of them who are maybe interested in this already, or maybe they're not as well versed yet. What is classical education and why is it so important?
I'll answer your question directly and then tell you a little bit about the history. So the classical education is an educational approach that focuses on truth, which people might say, well, that's what all education is. Well, unfortunately, not anymore. And the way it does that is to go through a very disciplined series of studies of subjects in the early grades called the trivium. And for people who think Latin words are scary, stay with me. Trivium is just learning phonics, learning how to spell, learning the logical order of words, and then reading good fiction, reading good nonfiction, of course, learning math and science. And I'll just say for members of the audience who might be scientists, mathematicians, STEM people, classical education is it is the greatest foundation to STEM education. And as a result of classical education, people will read the great books, as they're called. Students will be part of what we call the Great Conversation, capital G, capital C, because it's a conversation that men and women for millennia now have been having about what is the meaning of God? Who is God? For someone who isn't religious, what's the meaning of the human person? What's the relationship between the human person and the state? Very relevant to the conversation we're having here. What's my relationship as a human to nature? And other obviously very relevant questions. This is the point, that when you see students in a classical school and they get to these pivotal grades like 5th grade or 8th grade or obviously 12th grade, they are students who know how to think. They're students who, and this is coming from this educator, me, they do the most important educational skill that only a few percentage points of Americans understand. That's synthesizing information. And so if you can synthesize information, this is the last point about the definition of classical schools. If you can synthesize information, then you have a natural skepticism toward the atomization of society, because properly ordered, in truth, in goodness, and in beauty, in spite of all of mankind's imperfections as humans, that you can synthesize this into a meaning. And when we have a unified meaning, and we understand that, or at least understand aspects of it, we also tend to be very joyful. And so anyone who, after that definition, is still a skeptic of classical education should just visit one. Visit a classical school, Protestant school, Catholic, plenty non-sectarian classical schools. There are many flavors of how you can do this, but all of that to say it also used to be called education until the 20th century. And for anyone who still isn't convinced, then the onus is on you to prove to me that since the 1970s, when we've spent $11 trillion on schools, noble intentions, we ought to educate everyone in the United States. We spent $11 trillion on it. And for every demographic group in this country, attainment in mathematics, in the sciences, in reading, in history have gone down. And we're now barely in the top 75 in the world in educational attainment. Tell me that it isn't time for a revival in classical education. But the good news, Lila, to sum up here, is that parents are ahead of the policymakers, and they've been voting with their feet, starting homeschool classical co-ops, starting classical schools of all stripes. And the good news is that the great news is we're living through the revival. And in our lifetimes, we're going to see it. And in our children's lifetimes, by the time they're sitting here doing what you and I are doing, perhaps, when they talk about education, it's going to be classical.
I love that. Well, and I'm so blessed because I was homeschooled classical, with classical education. And my parents started a classical academy. At your talk last night, there was a friend of mine, and he kind of was joking, half serious though. He's, I don't know, in his 30s. I wish I want to be classically educated. Can I go to classical school? How do I do this as an adult?
If I may, the greatest request that parents of kids in classical schools have is, teach me this.
Right. Because it's learning how to think, as you said. I think so much of it.